Everyone has heard at least once in their life about the famous story of a curse in the tomb of Tutankhamun. The matter was popular at the time, and still today the story continues to fascinate and stir the interest of people. So yes, there was indeed a curse in the most famous tomb of ancient Egypt, but not the one you think. Before recalling the context of the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb on November 22, 1922, it's important to introduce the two protagonists of the story, Howard Carter and Lord Carnarvon. Howard Carter is an English Egyptologist born in 1874 in England. He was the youngest of a family that already counts 10 children. Because of his fragile health, he couldn't go to school, so he followed private lessons at home. At the age of 16, he accompanied his father, a talented painter, to the home of Lord Amherst of Hackney, an English nobleman who owned the third largest Egyptian collection in the country. The young Howard discovered the fascinating Egyptian civilization and befriended Lady Cecil, Lord Amherst's daughter, who will become one of the first female Egyptologists. It was her who introduced him to a very close and exclusive circle of English Egyptologists of the time and got him a job as roadman with the Egypt Exploration Society. At the age of 17, Howard Carter became the youngest member of this very famous historical and archaeological society. In Egypt, Howard Carter first worked as draftman for several excavation missions before being appointed Inspector of Antiquities for the Service of Egyptian Antiquities. In 1907, Gaston Maspero, then at the head of this organization, introduced him to Lord Carnarvon, an English nobleman who wished to join forces with a professional to begin excavations in Egypt. The two men got along wonderfully, and it was decided that they would work together. Howard Carter would have liked to be able to explore the Valley of the Kings, but the concession was already taken and he had to wait until 1914 and the dawn of the First World War to finally obtain the invaluable permit to dig. Then began a campaign of excavations to find the tomb of King Tutankhamun, an exciting but long and not very fruitful adventure. While Lord Carnarvon told him that he no longer wished to finance the 8th campaign, and we can understand why, Howard Carter succeeded in convincing him to grant him an additional year. On the 5th day of his final season of excavations, on November 4, 1922, the workers announced to Howard Carter that some steps had been exhumed. And in the sector, who says steps says a grave to be discovered. A telegram was sent to Lord Carnarvon's castle in Highclere, a sumptuous residence that those who have followed the Downton Abbey series will have recognized immediately. Lord Carnarvon replied that he was on his way and will be accompanied by his daughter, Lady Evelyn, a history and archaeology buff. George Edward Stanhope Molyneux Herbert Carnarvon is an English nobleman passionate about travel and sport, born in 1866. He was the second person to have officially obtained a driving license in England. In fact, the first, because the first driving license was graciously granted to Her Majesty Queen Victoria, who did not even have to take it. This did not prevent him from having a car accident at the age of 34. In his defense, the accident was due to his driver and not him. For a while, he was blind and suffered from a sunken rib cage, severe burns to his legs, a broken jaw and dislocated arms. When his doctor recommended that he recovers in a hot, dry climate, Lord Carnarvon decided to move to Egypt in 1903. While there, he contacted Gaston Maspero to play the role of apprentice archaeologist and then met Howard Carter. Following a telegram announcing the discovery of a tomb by his collaborator, he left for Egypt with his daughter. November 24, 1922, the workers officially cleared the tomb in the presence of the Egyptologist Reginald Engelbach, the official representative of the Service of Egyptian Antiquities. At the time, no one knew if it was indeed the real tomb of Tutankhamun. Very quickly, the workmen cleared away the rubble that had until then hidden the entrance to the tomb. After Howard Carter had taken photographs and readings of the necropolis seals that stamped the wall entrance all over the place, his men dismantled the brick door made of dried mud. On the other side, a corridor was filled to the ceiling with rubble and large stones. It was decided that Reginald Engelbach would return when it had been completely cleared. Except that on November 28, when Howard Carter, Lord Carnarvon, Lady Evelyn and Arthur Callender, an Egyptologist of the mission, found themselves in front of a second walled entrance, the representative of the Egyptian authorities was not informed immediately. A famous scene follows. Howard Carter made a hole in the brick wall, passed his head and a lamp, and remained stunned with admiration. The only thing he will manage to say to his acolytes who pressed him to tell what he sees, "I see wonders." But he will not be satisfied with just seeing them. He made the hole bigger enough for the four explorers to enter the antechamber. Long before the official discovery, these four had already entered the tomb and visited the antechamber, the burial chamber, the treasury, and perhaps the annex. At the official opening of the tomb the next day, more people entered the sacred place, and the world learned that King Tutankhamun's tomb had been discovered with thousands of precious objects inside. Quickly, the silent Valley of the Kings is invested by hundreds of curious people, locals, tourists, and of course, journalists. On February 16, 1923, the teams of Howard Carter and Lord Carnarvon entered the burial chamber of a king. A few days later, the tomb was closed to allow the archaeologists to rest for a while, and Lord Carnarvon was declining health, worried his entourage left to rest in Aswan, far from media hullabaloo that reigned in Luxor. There, he was bitten on the cheek by a mosquito, the most common thing in Egypt. Back in Luxor, the next day or two, he cut his cheek while shaving, right where the mosquito bite was. That's all it took to trigger an infection that he would not survive. On April 5, 1923, considerably weakened by the infection, he was finally carried off by pneumonia in Cairo, where he had been repatriated in urgently. His sudden death triggered the most famous curse story in the world. On March 24, 1923, the Daily Express reported the seemingly prophetic words of a famous best-selling author of the day, Mary Corelli. "I cannot but think that some risks are run by breaking into the last rest of a king of Egypt, whose tomb is specially and solemnly guarded, and robbing him of possessions." In one of her books, she had spoken precisely about a dark curse, and the current events allowed her to resurface in the media. Death comes on wings to he who enters the tomb of a pharaoh. Coincidentally, when Lord Carnarvon died, her words resurfaced, slightly updated. Death comes to he who touches the tomb of a pharaoh. The media and the authors seize with delight the dark but modern prophecy and go as far as telling that Howard Carter would have himself seen and destroyed this inscription in the king's tomb. Very quickly, an amalgam was consciously established between the formulas of what is called the call to the living in Egyptology and this alleged curse that would have been written at the entrance of the tomb of the young king. The call to the living is a formula that can be found at the entrance of a mastabas, namely the tombs of dignitaries of the Old Kingdom, the time of the first Egyptian periods. The call to the living calls out to whoever passes by and invites him or her to enter the tomb to say a prayer or at least the name of the deceased. The nobles were afraid that if the name was forgotten, they would end up forgotten by the gods and disappear forever. The formula promised the passerby that the deceased owner of a tomb would intercede in his favor with the gods, if he fulfilled his wish. But beware of the one who entered the tomb with bad intentions. He was promised the rope that would strangle him, the flame that would burn him, the water that would drown him, an unpleasant encounter with a crocodile, and so on. From there, to qualify this formula as a curse, there was only one step that many people gladly took, and in particular, several of the journalists who commented on Lord Carnarvon's death. As Lord Carnarvon and Howard Carter had decided, for a substantial fee, to grant exclusivity of the discovery to the English newspaper The Times, one can easily imagine the frustration of dozens of journalists who saw, day after day, fabulous pieces of furniture coming out without being able to present them or comment on them. The day after Lord Carnarvon's death, media outlets around the world speculated that a curse might have caused his death, launching one of the most resounding pieces of fake news in history. His death was a real boon and blessing for all those journalists who finally had a scoop as juicy as it was macabre to tell their readers. The story of a curse crossed the seas and oceans. From a worker to the high spheres of the state, everyone was fascinated by this mysterious death, which followed the most significant archaeological discovery of all times. It was thus necessary to find all victims to fit this invaluable thread. According to the media, in total, this curse would have made no less than 27 victims in 10 years. If, of course, we agree to leave out of the list the supposedly mysterious death of Egyptologists such as Jean-François Champollion, to whom some people attributed the responsibility to poor Tutankhamun. In 1934, the American Egyptologist Herbert Wenlock, assistant curator at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York and one of Howard Carter's rare friends, decided in vain to make a list of the supposed victims to try to put an end to the trickery. But when people want to believe, you can bring them all the proof you want. It's useless, because we have decided and we need to believe. Here are its conclusions and its demonstration. If the curse had struck the people who had entered the tomb first, there would have been 26 victims. But in 10 years, only 6 of the 26 people who entered the tomb first died. I would like to qualify this first point because Herbert Wenlock made his statement by establishing it on the official opening of the tomb. However, as we have seen, the first people to have entered the tomb unofficially were Howard Carter, Lord Carnarvon, Lady Evelyn and Arthur Callender. Apart from Lord Carnarvon, the other 3 died much later. If the curse had struck the people who had witnessed the opening of the sarcophagus, there would have been 22 victims, but only 1 died in the 10 years that followed. If the curse had struck the people who had performed the autopsy of the real mummy, there would have been 10 victims, but none of them died 10 years after the fact. I will stop at this last observation, which proves in masterly way, if still necessary, that there was never a curse. If it had been a curse, the first person who would have been struck by it would logically have been Howard Carter, and for several reasons. He was the one who wanted to find Tutankhamun's tomb. He was the one who convinced Lord Carnarvon to finance his excavations. He was the one who first entered the tomb. He was the one who took Tutankhamun's mummy out of its eternal resting place, and even more seriously, he was the one who damaged the mummified body by exposing it to more than 60 degrees Celsius to try to melt the black resin that had drawn the golden coffin in the vat of a golden wooden coffin that contained it. He was the one who ripped off his head to detach more easily his famous mask. And finally, he was the one who ordered the dismemberment of a mummy to free more easily the jewels. Tutankhamun's lips were cut off at the shoulders, elbows, wrist, trunk and feet. This is an absolute scandal, and the irreversible damage caused to the mummy's body shows that if there had been a curse, it would have been Howard Carter who would have paid the price first, followed by the two executioners of the king. Dr. Douglas Derry, professor of anatomy at the Faculty of Medicine of Kasserine in Cairo, and Dr. Saleh Bey Hamdi, former director of the same faculty. The real victim in the story is poor Tutankhamun, and one can say that he was cursed to come across a digger such as Howard Carter. You want to know more? I devote a whole chapter with many photos to the subject in my book, The Tomb of Tutankhamun, The Other Side of the Story.